Welcome to Fog Street Mysteries, where every story begins in shadows and every clue glows under a single street lamp. Step inside, the next case is already waiting. Don't forget to share thoughts. Your feedback keeps the mystery alive. Now let's begin. Nero Wolfe and the Silent Conspiracy, a Nero Wolfe-style noir mystery. Chapter 1, A Death That Makes No Noise. If you want proof that Nero Wolfe believes the universe should arrange itself around his digestion, come by the brownstone at 6:45 any evening and watch him glare at the clock. I was doing just that, leaning in the doorway of the office, pretending to read the paper, when Fritz announced dinner with the solemnity of a state funeral and Wolfe rose from his chair like a continent shifting. The orchids upstairs had been inspected at 4. The beer had been consumed at 5. Dinner at 7. The world, in Wolfe's view, was finally behaving itself. Then the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. 6:47. Wolfe stopped mid-stride. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his massive head toward me. "Archie," he said, in the tone he used for errors in logic and crimes against civilization, "if you answer that bell, you will be responsible for the consequences." "That's funny," I said, already moving. I was thinking the same thing about not answering it. The bell rang again, longer this time. Insistent. Official. I opened the door to find Inspector Kramer filling the doorway, hat tilted, face set in the expression he wore when the police department had a problem it didn't like. "Evening, Archie," he said. "Is he in?" "No," I told him. "He evaporated. Happens at dinner time." Kramer stepped past me without waiting for an invitation. "Tell him I need 5 minutes." I did. Wolfe listened in silence, his eyes narrowing as Kramer's voice drifted from the office. When the inspector finished, Wolfe said one word. "No." Kramer stiffened. "Now wait a minute. You have described a death," Wolfe went on, "that is regrettable but unremarkable. A man of 68, found dead in his study, no signs of violence, a physician's certificate ready to be signed, and a family eager for privacy. There is nothing here to interest me." Kramer's jaw tightened. "Harold Fenwick wasn't just any man." "No man is," Wolfe replied mildly. "Most of them are tedious." I cleared my throat. "For what it's worth, Wolfe, Kramer came all the way up here. That usually means something smells." Wolfe glared at me, then turned back to Kramer. 5 minutes, he said. "Begin again. This time, omit your assumptions." Kramer exhaled and did. "Fenwick, industrialist, philanthropist, member of enough boards to wallpaper a study. Found seated at his desk, hands folded, door locked from the inside. No disturbance. No weapon. No note. No sound heard by anyone in the house. The doctor said heart failure. The widow agreed. Everyone agreed. That, Wolfe said when Kramer finished, is precisely what troubles me." Kramer blinked. "What troubles you is that everybody agrees." "Yes. Agreement," Wolfe said, settling back into his chair at last, "is rare. Particularly among people with money." I saw it then, a flicker of interest, like a shark turning in deep water. Dinner, for the moment, was forgotten. "You want me to take a look," Wolfe said. Kramer nodded. "Off the record." Wolfe considered. "I will not leave this house." "I didn't think you would." "Archie will go." That was how, 40 minutes later, I found myself in a taxi heading uptown through streets slick with rain and sodium light, the brownstones passing like closed mouths. Mid-century New York has a way of keeping secrets, it stacks them in brick and shadow and pretends not to notice. Fenwick's house was quiet in the worst possible way. Not the calm of sleep, but the stillness of people waiting to see what would happen next. Mrs. Fenwick met me in the parlor. She was composed, dressed in black that looked chosen rather than required. Her eyes were dry. "You're Mr. Goodwin," she said. "Mr. Wolfe's assistant." "Assistant, emissary, lightning rod," I said. "Depends on the weather." She didn't smile. The study was upstairs. Heavy furniture, masculine taste, the kind of room men build to feel permanent. Fenwick sat behind the desk, exactly as Kramer had described. Hands folded. Face calm. No sign of struggle. Too calm. I noted the details Wolfe would want, the window slightly ajar, the phone on the desk, unplugged. A glass of water untouched. Papers neatly stacked. Nothing knocked over. Nothing wrong. Except that nothing was wrong. Did anyone hear anything? I asked, casually. Mrs. Fenwick shook her head. No. Not a sound. No. Her secretary, a thin woman with a notebook clutched like a shield, echoed it. We heard nothing. The stepson, hovering in the doorway, nodded. Dead quiet. 3 voices. Same words. Same rhythm. I thanked them and left, my notes light and my instincts heavy. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened as I reported. He asked few questions, but when he did, they were sharp. Did they volunteer information? No. Did they hesitate? Only before agreeing. Did anyone cry? No. Wolfe closed his eyes. Remarkable restraint. Or good acting, I offered. No, he said. Acting is loud. This was economical. Fritz appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. Dinner, he said firmly. Wolfe sighed, a sound like a cathedral settling. Very well. Murder can wait. Did you just say murder? I asked. Yes, Wolfe said, rising. Mr. Fenwick did not die naturally. Heart failure? Perhaps. But hearts fail for reasons. He paused. This was not a crime of commission, Archie. Then what kind was it? Wolfe turned to me, his eyes bright with something I recognized and never liked, anticipation. A crime, he said, of cooperation. Upstairs, the orchids breathed quietly in the dark. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent. And somewhere between silence and agreement, a man had died without making a sound. Chapter 2, The Respectable Circle. If you ever want to watch Nero Wolfe commit violence without leaving his chair, bring him a fact that doesn't fit. He won't throw a punch, he'll just apply pressure with that polished brain of his until the fact either reshapes itself or snaps in two. The morning after Fenwick's tidy little death, I found Wolfe in the office exactly where the laws of nature said he would be, installed in the red leather chair like a monarch awaiting tribute, a book open on his lap, a glass of beer on the side table, because Wolfe regards beer as a form of moral balance. Upstairs, the orchids were being tended. Fritz was clanking in the kitchen with the purposeful menace of a man who loves you but will not tolerate late breakfast. The brownstone smelled faintly of damp wool and orchid soil, New York in winter, brought indoors and civilized. I sat at my desk and opened my notebook. Wolfe didn't look up. Proceed. Nice to see you too, I said. I brought you a respectable circle. Now he looked. Wolfe's eyes were the color of stale ale and twice as skeptical. You have invented a phrase. No, I stole it. Fenwick's people are so respectable they probably iron their consciences. Wife, partner, secretary, stepson, 4 faces, 1 story. Uniformity, Wolfe murmured, is seldom innocent. Uniformity, I said, is also boring. Shall I spice it up with a little personality? The widow, Celia Fenwick, she's composed like a banker. She didn't cry once. Not even a sniffle for the benefit of visiting police. A widow who does not cry, Wolfe said, is not necessarily suspicious. But a widow who is unruffled is. Then you'll enjoy the rest. The secretary, Miss Lorna Vale, thin, precise, clutches her notebook like it's a life preserver. She speaks in sentences that sound pre-approved. Secretaries, Wolfe observed, often know more than they admit and admit more than they should. And the business partner, I went on, Gideon Crane. Big shot with an expensive overcoat and a smile that could sell sand to the Sahara. He shook my hand like he was sealing a deal, not greeting the assistant of an uninvited detective. Wolfe's lips twitched. That was almost a smile for him. Almost. The stepson, I said, Martin Hale. 20-something. Looks like he was born with a grudge and polished it daily. He hovered like he wanted to ask if the body was really dead. Wolfe sat motionless a moment, then lifted his beer and drank. And yet they all concurred on one point. That they heard nothing, I said. Dead quiet. No thump, no shout, no chair scraped back. Fenwick dies in his locked study like a gentleman stepping out for air. Wolfe's gaze sharpened. Tell me about the study. I gave him what I'd collected, the window ajar, the glass of water untouched, the phone unplugged, papers stacked with tidy arrogance. And the corpse, too arranged. Did you touch anything? Wolfe asked. Only my hat, I said. I left the room as pure as a choirboy, which in my case is quite an accomplishment. Wolfe grunted. You will return. Today. You will speak to each member of this respectable circle, separately. You will observe not what they say, but what they do not say. Ah, I said. The famous Wolfe method. Mining silence. Exactly, Wolfe replied. Silence is not emptiness. It is substance. Fritz appeared in the doorway and announced breakfast. Wolfe rose with the resigned grandeur of a man dragged from contemplation by appetite. While he ate, I grabbed my coat and went to do what I did best, run around New York while Wolfe grew smarter in an armchair. Outside, the city had the color of cigarette ash and wet pavement. Taxis hissed past like impatient snakes. The wind off the river cut through my collar and reminded me why people drank. I took a cab uptown, gave the driver the address, and watched brownstones glide by, stoic brick faces with 1,000 secrets behind their curtains. Fenwick's house was quieter than yesterday. The kind of quiet that's manufactured and maintained, like the silence in a church when everyone's pretending to pray but really watching the collection plate. Celia Fenwick received me in the parlor again. Same black dress. Same calm. Same eyes that didn't offer a scrap of welcome. You've returned, she said. I'm like a bad penny, I told her. Mr. Wolfe hates loose ends. Also, he hates being wrong. Mr. Wolfe did not come. He rarely does. He's more of a thinker than a walker. Her lips tightened faintly. My husband is dead. The doctor. The doctor said heart failure, I finished. I heard. Mr. Wolfe has a hobby of not believing things just because they're convenient. I studied her as I spoke. No fidgeting. No shifting weight. She sat as if she'd been trained to endure inquiries the way other women endured needlepoint. Mrs. Fenwick, I said, how long were you married? 14 years. And how would you describe Mr. Fenwick? Her eyes flicked, fast, toward the ceiling, then back to me. A disciplined man. Disciplined, I repeated. Anything else? Warm. Generous. Cheerful. A disciplined man, she said again, as if it covered everything worth saying. It was an answer that sounded safe. Too safe. Who found him? I asked. Miss Vale. She went to bring him tea. What time? Shortly after 10. Did she call for you? No. She called Dr. Morley. That was interesting, and I leaned into it. Not you. Not your stepson. Not Mr. Crane. No, she said, and then, very faintly, she added, there was no need. No need. A dead man in a locked study, and no need. I thanked her and asked to speak to Miss Vale. The secretary met me in a hallway like a ghost that had been issued a typewriter. She was pale, straight-backed, and wore a blouse that looked ironed by fear. Her notebook was in her hand again. Miss Vale, I said, you found Mr. Fenwick. Yes. Tell me about it. She recited it, knocked, no answer, tried the knob, locked, called to him, no reply, fetched the key from the cabinet, entered, found him dead. No scream? I asked. She blinked once. No. No gasp. No calling his name. I called his name. Quietly. Why quietly? Her lips parted, then closed. I don't know. That was the first crack, tiny, but real. I filed it away like a jewel. Miss Vale, I said gently, Mr. Fenwick unplugged his phone before he died. I don't know that he did. It was unplugged. Her eyes flicked down, then up. Perhaps he did not want to be disturbed. By whom? She hesitated. Business calls. At 10 at night, I said. In his own home. It happened, she insisted, and there was a note in her voice, annoyance, or anxiety. Hard to tell. Did Mr. Fenwick have enemies? I asked. Not that I know. Did he have friends? Another pause. He had associates. Associates. No friends. No warmth. Everybody in this house spoke like they were reading a company memo. I left her and asked for Gideon Crane. Crane came downstairs like a man arriving at his own party. He wore a gray suit that probably had its own accountant. He shook my hand again with the same salesman's grip. Goodwin, he said, still working for the big genius. Somebody has to keep him fed with puzzles. Crane smiled. Harold's death isn't a puzzle. It's a tragedy. Tragedies usually come with shouting, I said. This one didn't. His smile didn't change, but his eyes tightened. Harold was private. Private enough to die behind a locked door. Crane's voice stayed smooth. The police are satisfied. That's their weakness, I said. They get satisfied. Crane laughed politely, too politely. You're implying something, Mr. Goodwin. I'm implying that you're very good at implying nothing, I said. That hit. Not hard, but enough. His smile thinned. Fenwick's company, Fenwick Consolidated, I said. How's it doing? Well, Crane said. Exceptionally well. Then Fenwick's death is inconvenient. His eyes stayed on mine. Business is always inconvenient. Does his will favor anyone? I asked. He lifted his eyebrows. Now you're being crude. I'm being practical, I said. Wolfe likes motives. He collects them. Crane's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, then relaxed. I don't know the details of Harold's will. Not even roughly. No. It was another safe answer. A man like Crane would know the weather in Tokyo and the mood in Washington, yet he didn't know the will of his closest partner. Sure. I thanked him and went hunting for the stepson. Martin Hale was in the dining room, poking at cold coffee like it had insulted him. He looked up when I entered, eyes sharp, restless. You again, he said. That's what my friends say, I told him. Only they say it with less enthusiasm. What do you want? A picture, I said. Of your stepfather. Of this house. Of last night. People talk. You're young. You might even tell the truth by accident. His mouth twitched. My stepfather was a control freak. That was more human than anyone else had been. How so? He controlled everything, Hale said, leaning forward. The company. The house. My mother. Even the air. You know what he did when he didn't like a conversation? He'd unplug the phone and lock himself in that study. There it was. The phone. And you knew that, I said. Hale shrugged. Everybody knew that. Everybody, I repeated. Yet nobody mentioned it. He narrowed his eyes. What are you getting at? I stood there a moment, letting the silence stretch until it grew teeth. Then I said, lightly, I'm getting at this, you all agree too well. You're like a quartet playing the same note. That's not grief. That's rehearsal. Hale's face flushed. You think we planned his death? I think somebody planned something, I said. And I think the plan depends on nobody making noise. He stared at me. For a second, I thought he might swing. Instead, he looked away, jaw working. He wasn't a saint, he said finally. No, I agreed. Saints rarely lock themselves in studies. When I left Fenwick's house, the air outside felt louder. The street had horns, footsteps, life. The house had none. Back in the taxi, I scribbled notes and watched my reflection wobble in the glass. Wolfe would like the phone detail. Wolfe would like the quietly from Miss Vale. Wolfe would like the way everyone said associates instead of friends. Most of all, Wolfe would like the pattern. Each of them benefited a little, but none benefited enough to kill alone. That was the part that chilled me. Because if nobody benefits enough alone, then maybe nobody killed alone. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair again, as if the day hadn't moved at all. The orchids perfumed the air with calm superiority. Fritz, somewhere, was committing miracles with butter. Wolfe looked at me. Report. I did. When I mentioned the unplugged phone habit, Wolfe's eyes brightened. When I quoted Miss Vale's quietly, his fingers steepled. When I described Crane's too smooth ignorance, Wolfe's mouth tightened. When I finished, Wolfe sat silent for a long moment, staring past me as if the room contained invisible diagrams. Finally he spoke. Archie, he said, these people do not merely share a story. They share an understanding. An understanding, I said. Like a conspiracy. Wolfe's gaze settled on me, heavy and exact. Yes. But not a conspiracy of action. I waited. A conspiracy, Wolfe said softly, of restraint. He lifted his beer and drank, and the bubbles rose and vanished, silent, cooperative, and inevitable. Outside, New York kept making noise for everyone else. Inside our brownstone, Wolfe was listening to the quiet. Chapter 3, The Locked Study Problem. If Nero Wolfe had been a less civilized man, he would have nailed a sign to the brownstone door reading, "Do not disturb, thinking in progress." As it was, he merely glowered at the world and expected it to comply. That morning, the office smelled of orchids and deliberation. Wolfe occupied his red leather chair with the immobility of a mountain that had decided to read a book. His beer sat untouched at his elbow, an alarming sign that something had claimed precedence over refreshment. I paced. "You're wearing a groove in the carpet," Wolfe said without looking up. "I'm exercising," I told him. "You should try it sometime. It keeps the blood moving." "My blood," Wolfe replied, "moves when it is summoned." "Sit down and tell me again, slowly, about the study." I sat. I told him again. The locked door. The neat desk. The unplugged phone. The open window. The glass of water untouched. The man sitting straight back like he was posing for a portrait entitled "Late Capitalist at Rest." Wolfe listened with his eyes closed. "At what time," he asked, "did Mr. Fenwick customarily retire to his study?" "After dinner." "Around 9:30. "And the household?" "Mrs. Fenwick upstairs. The secretary finishing notes. The stepson, floating. Crane gone by then." "Yet no one," Wolfe said, "heard anything." "Not a whisper," I said. "Which is impressive in a house with stairs that creak like arthritic knees." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Describe the door." "Solid. Old wood. Heavy lock. Locked from the inside. Windows. One open a crack. Street noise. Minimal. Quiet block. You could hear a match strike." Wolfe's fingers steepled. "Then the absence of sound is not merely notable. It is significant." "Because?" I prompted. "Because men do not generally die without producing some disturbance," Wolfe said. "Even gentlemen." I leaned back. You're thinking timing. I am thinking of sequence, Wolfe corrected. Sequence is time with manners. He reached for his beer and drank, eyes distant. Archie, let us reconstruct, not what happened, but what should have happened. That was my cue to get out of the chair and into a cab. Fenwick's house welcomed me back with the enthusiasm of a mausoleum. I asked for the study again and got it, reluctantly, from Miss Vale, who hovered in the doorway like a bookmark afraid of being lost. Miss Vale, I said, humor me. She hated that phrase. It showed. About what? About sound. Her lips pressed thin. I've told the police. I know. I'm not the police. I'm worse. I repeat questions. I walked the room, deliberately loud. I scraped a chair leg. I rapped the desk with my knuckles. The sound carried. It always does in old houses, Wood remembers. If Mr. Fenwick had fallen, I said, you'd have heard it. Yes, she said. Too quickly. If he'd called out? Yes. If he'd knocked something over? Yes. And if someone else had been here? She hesitated. I don't understand. Neither do I said cheerfully. That's why I'm asking. I crossed to the window and leaned out. The street was quiet but not dead, tires on pavement, a radio somewhere, a door closing 3 houses down. You hear that? I asked. Yes. So if Mr. Fenwick opened this window for air. He often did, she blurted. And then something happened, I continued, there'd be sound. She swallowed. Unless he didn't make any. People make noise, I said. It's their flaw. I turned back to the desk. The phone sat where it had been, still unplugged. I picked it up, plugged it in, dialed the operator, then unplugged it again. You see? I said. A small sound. A click. Even that counts. Miss Vale nodded, but her eyes had drifted to the door. Waiting. Who else was awake at 10? I asked. My employer's wife. Mr. Hale. The cook. And you, I said. And me. And no one heard anything. She shook her head. No. Not even breathing. I said lightly. Her eyes snapped back to mine. Breathing? I smiled. I'm kidding. Mostly. She relaxed, too much. Relief is noisy, even when people think it isn't. I left her and went downstairs to find Martin Hale. He was in the parlor, flipping through a magazine upside down. Studying, I said. He snorted. Killing time. Funny choice of words. He stiffened. What do you want now? A sound check, I said. Last night, 10 o'clock, where were you? In my room. Door open. Sometimes. Music? No. Phone? Yes. Plugged in? Yes. And you heard nothing? No. Not even your stepfather moving around? He always moved around, Hale said. You stop hearing it. That was interesting. How so? He paced, Hale said. Back and forth. Thinking. You could hear his shoes. I latched onto that. You could hear his shoes. Yes. Last night? Hale hesitated. Just a breath. But it was there. No, he said. So a man who usually paces, didn't. Hale's jaw tightened. Maybe he didn't feel like it. Maybe, I said. Or maybe something changed. He glared at me. You're fishing. I'm trolling, I corrected. Big waters. I left him chewing on that and went outside to breathe air that wasn't steeped in restraint. A taxi took me downtown to a diner I liked, one with chipped cups and coffee that tasted like determination. I ordered eggs and thought about shoes. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him. The orchids were serene. Fritz was chopping something with enthusiasm. "Well?" Wolfe said. "Fenwick paste," I said. "Usually." Shoes audible. "Last night, nothing." Wolfe's eyes opened fully. "Continue." Miss Vale reacted to the idea of breathing like I'd suggested arson in church. Hale admitted the pacing stopped. "Everyone insists on quiet, but they define it differently." Wolfe nodded. "Because they are remembering selectively." "Or agreeing," I said. "Agreement," Wolfe said, "is a form of action." He considered, then asked, "The window?" "Open a crack," I said. "For air." "For sound to escape," Wolfe said softly. I blinked. "You think?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that if a sound were made, someone ensured it would not be heard." "How?" I demanded. "Soundproofing? Music? Timing?" Wolfe raised a finger. "Do not leap. Observe." He leaned back. "Archie, when did the household discover Mr. Fenwick was dead?" "Shortly after 10. And yet," Wolfe said, "there is a period between 9:30 and 10 in which no one heard his customary pacing." "Which suggests that something interrupted his routine," Wolfe said. Quietly. I stood. "You want me to push?" "Yes," Wolfe said. Gently. "Apply pressure to their timelines. Ask again. Alter the phrasing. People remember differently when they are uncertain. And if they're certain, then they are lying," Wolfe said. "Or worse, coordinated." I grabbed my coat. That night, I made calls. Late-night calls have a way of pulling truth out of bed in its pajamas. Mrs. Fenwick answered on the third ring, voice steady. "Mrs. Fenwick," I said, "forgive the hour. Did you hear your husband pacing last night?" "No," she said. "Did you expect to?" "Yes." "That was new." "Why?" "Because he always did." "And you noticed the absence?" "Yes." "And you did nothing?" There was a pause. "Not long. Just long enough." "There was no need," she said. That phrase again. Miss Vale was next. She sounded flustered, as if sleep had been ambushed. "Did Mr. Fenwick pace?" I asked. "Yes." "Last night?" "No." "And you noticed?" "Yes." "And said nothing?" "I thought," she stopped. "You thought what?" I said gently. "I thought he wanted quiet." "And you obliged," I said. Click. Hale was harder. He answered angry. "You again?" "Always," I said. "Last chance." "Did you notice the quiet?" "Yes." And I was glad," he snapped. He finally shut up. That was honest. Too honest to be rehearsed. I went back to the brownstone with the city sliding by in streaks of light and shadow. Wolfe listened as I reported the calls, his expression sharpening with each repetition of "noticed the absence." When I finished, Wolfe sat silent. The orchids breathed. The clock ticked. Finally he said, "They did not fail to hear, Archie. They heard silence, and accepted it." "Like a signal," I said. "Precisely." I frowned. "But that doesn't kill a man." "No," Wolfe agreed. "It merely allows him to die." I waited. Wolfe did not elaborate. He never does when he's enjoying the tension. "Next," he said at last, "we will test their agreement." "How?" Wolfe smiled, "A thin, dangerous thing. By disturbing it." Outside, a taxi horn blared, loud and impatient. Inside, Nero Wolfe was planning to make some noise where none was supposed to exist. Chapter 4, Breaking the Silence. If there's one thing Nero Wolfe enjoys more than being right, it's watching other people discover they've been wrong. Preferably in stages, preferably without him having to leave his chair. That afternoon, the office had the tense, expectant air of a courtroom before the jury comes back. Wolfe sat immovable in the red leather armchair, fingers steepled, orchids upstairs having been inspected precisely on schedule. Fritz moved in and out with coffee, casting suspicious looks at me as if I were personally responsible for the disruption of civilized routine. Wolfe broke the silence first. "Archie," he said, "you will now lie." I blinked. "I do that anyway." "You'll have to be more specific. You will tell each member of the Fenwick household a slightly different version of what we believe occurred," Wolfe went on calmly. "Not enough to alarm them, just enough to require adjustment." "Adjustment," I said. "Like tapping a crystal glass to see where it cracks." "An apt metaphor," Wolfe replied. "Proceed." I grabbed my coat, notebook, and a taxi. The city outside had the look of a damp newspaper, gray, smudged, and full of bad news if you read too closely. Celia Fenwick, the first variation. Mrs. Fenwick received me in the parlor again, posture flawless, eyes unreadable. I sat across from her and leaned forward confidentially. "Mrs. Fenwick," I said, "Mr. Wolfe believes your husband collapsed at his desk after pacing, struck the corner, and died instantly. A fall." Her reaction was minimal, but not non-existent. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the study door. "He did not fall," she said. "Are you certain?" I asked lightly. "Because no one heard him." Her lips tightened. "He was seated." "Then you do know," I said. She stiffened. "I know my house." I nodded sympathetically. "Of course. I'll let Mr. Wolfe know." Her fingers curled slightly against the arm of the chair. It was nothing, except that 5 seconds earlier, they hadn't been curled. Lorna Vale, the second variation. Miss Vale met me near the stairs, notebook clutched like armor. "Miss Vale," I said, "Mr. Wolfe thinks Mr. Fenwick made a phone call shortly before his death. One that upset him." Her breath caught. "Just a touch." "He did not use the phone," she said. "That's interesting," I said. "Because it was unplugged." "Yes," she said quickly. "He always unplugged it." "Always," I repeated. "Even when expecting a call?" She froze. "I don't know." I nodded. "Funny. Mrs. Fenwick said he wasn't expecting one." Miss Vale swallowed. "Mrs. Fenwick would not know his business." "That's what Mr. Crane said too," I said cheerfully. Her eyes darted to the parlor. The silence between us thickened until it became almost audible. Gideon Crane, the third variation. Crane met me in his office downtown, all glass and polish and controlled confidence. I gave him the third version. "Crane," I said, "it looks like Fenwick realized something financial, right before he died. A betrayal." Crane laughed. "Too fast. That's melodramatic." "Is it?" I said. "Because it would explain why no one called for help." His smile thinned. "There was nothing to call for." "And you know that," I said. "I know the man," Crane snapped, then caught himself. "I knew the man." I leaned back. "You sound certain for someone who wasn't there." Crane's jaw tightened. "We discussed matters earlier that day." "Oh." I said. "Mrs. Fenwick didn't mention that." "That's because," Crane said, then stopped. "Yes." I prompted. "That's because it was business." "Of course," I said. "Everything is." But the damage was done. He'd admitted contact. Something new. Something unshared. Martin Hale, the fourth variation. Hale didn't wait for me to speak. "You're stirring things up," he said angrily. "My mother's upset." "That's the idea," I said. "Listen, Hale, what if your stepfather realized someone intended to let him die?" Hale stared at me. "That's insane." "Is it?" I said. Because you noticed the quiet. His face flushed. Everyone noticed. And everyone agreed not to act. He stood abruptly. You're accusing us. I'm observing you, I said. There's a difference. He laughed bitterly. You think we planned it? I think, I said, that none of you wanted to be the first to make noise. That hit. He sank back into the chair. He deserved it, Hale muttered. Did he? I asked. Hale looked up sharply, realized what he'd said, and went pale. I didn't mean. I know, I said. You meant to stay quiet. The crack. By the time I left Fenwick's house, dusk had settled like a lid over the city. Streetlights buzzed on, yellow and tired. I hailed a cab and headed back to the brownstone, my notebook heavy with small fractures. Wolfe listened without interrupting as I reported each reaction. He closed his eyes when I mentioned the shared phrases, the unconscious corrections, the way each suspect assumed knowledge they hadn't been given. Finally he spoke. They are correcting for one another, Wolfe said. That is the sound of coordination. Then we're close, I said. Yes, Wolfe replied. Which makes this the dangerous moment. I frowned. Dangerous how? Wolfe did not answer immediately. He lifted his beer, drank, and set it down with care. Because, he said, you have just informed them that silence is no longer sufficient. The phone rang as if on cue. Wolfe did not move. I answered. A man's voice, tight, strained. Mr. Goodwin, this is Dr. Morley. Yes. I said. There's been an incident. My stomach tightened. What kind of incident? Your brakes, he said. They appear to have been tampered with. I closed my eyes. Wolfe watched me carefully as I hung up. An accident? Wolfe asked. A warning, I said. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. Someone has broken ranks. That night, as I walked home instead of driving, the city felt closer, louder. Every footstep echoed. Every shadow stretched. Somewhere, someone had decided silence wasn't enough anymore, and that meant Wolfe was right, the conspiracy was starting to talk. Chapter 5, The Cost of Cooperation. If someone wants to scare you off a case, they don't usually start with subtlety. They send a brick through a window, a fist through your ribs, or a lawyer through your front door. The message is loud, unmistakable, and generally unambiguous. What I got instead was a set of tampered brakes. That's not intimidation, that's instruction. It says, we know where you go. We know how you move. And we prefer you quiet. The next morning, I walked into the brownstone with my nerves jangling and my patience already shot. Nero Wolfe was in his chair, of course, a massive island of calm surrounded by the faint perfume of orchids and the promise of breakfast. Fritz was humming in the kitchen, oblivious to the fact that someone had tried to turn his employer's assistant into modern art on asphalt. Wolfe looked at my face and frowned. You are late. I took the scenic route, I said. On foot. That is inefficient. So is dying, I replied. But someone apparently put it on the agenda. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. Report. I told him about the brakes, the mechanic, the neat professionalism of the sabotage. Wolfe listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, his face composed in that infuriating way that suggested murder was an abstract puzzle rather than a personal inconvenience. When I finished, he said calmly, good. I stared at him. Good. Yes, Wolfe said. The attempt was premature. That's comforting, I said. I'll engrave it on my headstone. Wolfe ignored that. This confirms my hypothesis. The conspiracy is no longer perfectly silent. Because I rattled it, I said. Because you threatened its equilibrium, Wolfe corrected. Someone has decided that restraint is no longer sufficient. Meaning? I demanded. Meaning, Wolfe said, that cooperation has a cost. He shifted in his chair. Archie, when several people commit a crime together without overt action, the danger lies not in doing too much, but in doing too little. I frowned. You're saying Fenwick wasn't killed by something that happened, but by something that didn't. Precisely. I waited, but Wolfe did not elaborate. He rarely does when he's enjoying himself. Fine, I said. Let's talk suspects before someone loosens the wheels on my shoes. Wolfe nodded once. Proceed. I paced, because sitting felt like tempting fate. Mrs. Fenwick, I said. Cool as ice water. She noticed the quiet and accepted it. She benefited, freedom, money, relief. Benefit, Wolfe said, does not equate to guilt. But it invites it. Miss Vale, I went on. She's wound tight. Loyal. Or afraid. She knew more about Fenwick's habits than she admitted. Fear, Wolfe murmured, is an excellent adhesive. Crane, I said. Too smooth. Too informed. He talked to Fenwick the day he died and pretended it didn't matter. Men who control money, Wolfe said, are accustomed to controlling narratives. And Hale, I finished. Angry. Resentful. Honest enough to be dangerous. He admitted he was glad the pacing stopped. Wolfe nodded slowly. Each suspect benefits slightly. None benefits decisively. That's the problem, I said. No one stands out. That, Wolfe replied, is the design. He leaned forward. Archie, imagine a system in which each participant performs an act so minor it is defensible, even innocent. One person delays. Another refrains. A third assumes. Individually, nothing is done. Collectively, everything. I stopped pacing. You're talking about withholding. Yes, Wolfe said. Withholding assistance. Withholding inquiry. Withholding alarm. And that killed Fenwick. Wolfe's eyes held mine. It allowed him to die. I rubbed my temples. That's thin ice in court. Which is why, Wolfe said, we will not go to court until the ice thickens. How? I asked. By making the cost of cooperation visible. He reached for his beer and drank, then set it down with care. Someone has already paid that cost by attempting to silence you. Lucky me. Indeed. Now we shall exploit their impatience. The phone rang again that afternoon. This time, it was Inspector Kramer, sounding tired and irritable. I've got a confession, he said. Wolfe's eyebrows rose. Mine shot up. From whom? Wolfe asked. Lorna Vale, Kramer said. She came in this morning. Said it was her fault. Claimed she found Fenwick alive and didn't call for help fast enough. I felt a cold knot settle in my stomach. She's lying. Maybe, Kramer said. But it's a confession. Wolfe's voice hardened. Bring her to me. You don't have jurisdiction. You have curiosity, Wolfe said. Indulge it. Kramer grumbled, but I could hear the hook sink in. An hour later, Miss Vale sat rigidly on the edge of a chair in Wolfe's office, hands folded, eyes red-rimmed. Kramer hovered nearby, skeptical but attentive. Wolfe regarded her like a specimen under glass. Miss Vale, Wolfe said gently, you have confessed to moral culpability. She nodded. I could have called. I should have called. You found Mr. Fenwick alive? Yes, she said. Breathing. Unconscious. And you delayed? Yes. Why? Wolfe asked. She hesitated. I thought he wanted to be left alone. Wolfe nodded. A plausible explanation. Yet incomplete. Kramer frowned. What's incomplete? Her solitude, Wolfe said. Miss Vale did not act alone. Miss Vale's head snapped up. I did. Wolfe raised a hand. No. You are attempting to protect others. Her eyes filled. They didn't tell me to. They did not need to, Wolfe said. The understanding already existed. Kramer shifted. You're saying this was planned? No, Wolfe replied. It was anticipated. I leaned forward. Miss Vale, did you tell anyone Fenwick was alive when you found him? She shook her head. Did anyone ask? I pressed. Another pause. Then, no. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. There it is. Kramer scowled. There what? The conspiracy, Wolfe said. Not of action, but of expectation. Each participant knew what silence would accomplish. Each relied on the others to maintain it. Miss Vale sobbed quietly. I didn't want to be the one. Wolfe opened his eyes. That is the most dangerous motive of all. Kramer exhaled. So what now? Wolfe straightened in his chair, his bulk seeming to settle with purpose. Now, he said, we gather everyone. Everyone? Kramer asked. Yes, Wolfe said. The widow. The partner. The stepson. Miss Vale. And then? I asked. Wolfe's mouth curved faintly. Then we removed the protection of shared silence. Miss Vale looked up, terrified. You'll destroy them. Wolfe's gaze was implacable. They destroyed themselves. That evening, after they left, I stood by the window and watched the city light up, one bulb at a time. Somewhere out there, people were talking, shouting, laughing, making noise like free citizens. Behind me, Wolfe rang for Fritz. Dinner, Wolfe said. After all this? I asked. Especially after all this, Wolfe replied. Civilization depends on routine. I thought of Fenwick, pacing alone in his study, waiting for help that never came. I thought of breaks loosened in the dark. Of a secretary trying to save others by sacrificing herself. The cost of cooperation, I realized, wasn't just death. It was responsibility. And Wolfe was about to make sure it got paid. Chapter 6, The False Confession. A false confession is like cheap perfume, it's meant to overwhelm your senses so you don't notice what's underneath. Nero Wolfe hates cheap perfume. He hates it even more when it's sprayed in his office. Miss Lorna Vale sat in the straight-backed chair opposite Wolfe's desk, hands folded with military precision, eyes fixed on a spot just above the carpet as if she expected the truth to crawl out from there and bite her. Inspector Kramer hovered to one side, hat on, jaw set, wearing the look of a man who wanted very badly to be finished with this business. Wolfe, of course, wanted the opposite. Miss Vale, Wolfe said, his voice low and even, you have confessed to criminal negligence. Yes, she said quickly. It was my fault. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk with a sense of humor. She was too ready. People who really did something awful usually try to wriggle. Miss Vale was bracing for impact. Kramer cleared his throat. She says she found Fenwick breathing and didn't call a doctor. That's enough for me. Wolfe did not look at him. Inspector, your enthusiasm for closure is admirable. It is also premature. Kramer scowled. You calling her a liar? I am calling her generous, Wolfe replied. Miss Vale flinched. Generous? Kramer repeated. Yes, Wolfe said. She is offering herself as a solution to your inconvenience. That's ridiculous, Miss Vale protested. I came on my own. Indeed, Wolfe said. You came alone. That is precisely my point. She stared at him, lips trembling. I don't understand. No, Wolfe said gently, you understand perfectly. You are simply hoping we do not. I pushed off the wall. Miss Vale, did anyone suggest you take the blame? No, she said. Absolutely not. Did anyone ask you to? I pressed. No. Did anyone tell you not to? I asked. She hesitated. Just a fraction. Enough. No, she said again. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Exactly. Kramer threw up his hands. This is nonsense. She admits she delayed. That's criminal. Perhaps, Wolfe said. But it is insufficient. Insufficient for what? Kramer demanded. For truth, Wolfe said. And truth, Inspector, is my jurisdiction. The office smelled faintly of orchids and tension. Fritz moved somewhere upstairs, blissfully unaware that a woman's conscience was unraveling downstairs. Wolfe leaned forward. Miss Vale, when you found Mr. Fenwick, did you believe he would die? She swallowed. I didn't know. But you suspected, Wolfe said. Yes. And yet you did not call for help. No. Why? Her eyes filled. Because I wasn't sure. Wolfe nodded. Uncertainty. A useful word. Kramer snorted. Uncertainty doesn't excuse negligence. No, Wolfe agreed. But it does explain restraint. I cut in. Miss Vale, did you expect someone else to act? She looked at me, startled. Did you expect Mrs. Fenwick to hear something? I asked. No. Did you expect Mr. Hale? I continued. She hesitated. He was awake. And Mr. Crane? I said. Her shoulders slumped. He had been there earlier. So you expected, Wolfe said softly, that someone else would make the first move. Miss Vale covered her face. I didn't want to be the one. There it was. The confession inside the confession. Kramer frowned. So she waited. Yes, Wolfe said. And so did everyone else. Kramer stared. You're saying they all did nothing. I am saying, Wolfe replied, that they did nothing together. Miss Vale's voice came muffled through her hands. I thought, if I stayed quiet, it would be all right. Wolfe's voice sharpened. Quiet is never all right. Kramer shook his head. You're stretching. On the contrary, Wolfe said. I am compressing. He turned to me. Archie, tell the inspector about the brakes. Kramer's eyes snapped to mine. What brakes? Mine, I said. Somebody loosened them. Professionally. As a suggestion. Kramer stiffened. When? After I started adjusting stories, I said. Breaking the harmony. Wolfe nodded. The moment silence became unstable, action occurred. Miss Vale looked up, horror-struck. Someone tried to kill you. Don't flatter yourself, I said. It was more of a reminder. Wolfe folded his hands. Miss Vale, your confession is false, not because you are innocent, but because you are not alone. I am, she insisted weakly. No, Wolfe said. You are a substitute. Kramer rubbed his face. All right. Suppose I buy this. Suppose it's some kind of group guilt. What do you want? Wolfe smiled faintly. An audience. An audience? Yes, Wolfe said. Bring them all here. Mrs. Fenwick. Mr. Crane. Mr. Hale. Miss Vale. Tomorrow evening. Kramer hesitated. For what? For conversation, Wolfe said. I find it clarifying. After Kramer left, with a promise that sounded suspiciously like a threat, Miss Vale remained seated, trembling. You shouldn't have come alone, I told her gently. She looked at me. I was trying to protect them. Wolfe's voice was calm, but unforgiving. Protection purchased with silence is merely delay. She nodded, defeated. What will happen to them? Wolfe regarded her. That depends on how loudly they continue to cooperate. She left shortly after, shoulders hunched, a woman who had mistaken obedience for loyalty. I poured myself a drink and sank into my chair. You know, Wolfe, there are easier ways to make a living. Yes, he said. But they are rarely as instructive. I took a sip. You really think one of them will crack? One already has, Wolfe replied. Miss Vale merely cracked in the wrong direction. And the others? They will be compelled to choose, Wolfe said. Speak, or maintain silence alone. Which is harder, I said. Infinitely, Wolfe agreed. That night, the city outside the brownstone felt restless. Sirens wailed somewhere far off. Taxis hissed past. New York was doing what it always did, making noise to prove it was alive. Inside, Wolfe sat reading, serene as a monk, while upstairs the orchid slept in humid peace. Routine intact. Mind engaged. I stared out the window and thought about Fenwick, lying in his chair, alive and dying at the same time, waiting for someone to decide he mattered enough to interrupt their evening. Silence, I realized, was a luxury. Tomorrow, Wolfe was going to take it away. Chapter 7, Wolfe Speaks. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into Nero Wolfe's office right before he opens his mouth. It isn't the polite kind, or the nervous kind. It's the kind that knows something unpleasant is about to happen and can't do a thing to stop it. That evening, the brownstone was packed tighter than Fritz's dumplings. Mrs. Celia Fenwick sat rigidly on the sofa, hands folded, chin lifted, dressed in morning black that looked like it had been tailored for defense. Gideon Crane occupied a chair near the window, composed and expensive, his smile laid out carefully as a business card. Martin Hale leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, defiant and jittery at the same time. Miss Lorna Vale perched on the edge of a chair like a schoolgirl waiting for the principal. Inspector Kramer stood near my desk, arms folded, skeptical but curious, his favorite posture. And Nero Wolfe sat in his red leather armchair, massive and immovable, fingers steepled beneath the brass desk lamp. The orchids upstairs had been tended on time. Dinner had been eaten. Beer had been poured. Civilization, according to Wolfe, was intact. Which meant it was time to dismantle someone else's. Wolfe surveyed the room without speaking. He enjoyed this part, the pause that made people wonder whether they should have brought lawyers instead of excuses. Finally, he spoke. You are all here, Wolfe said calmly, because a man died quietly. Crane cleared his throat. Mr. Wolfe, with respect. Wolfe raised a hand. I have not finished. Crane subsided. Harold Fenwick, Wolfe went on, did not die violently. There was no weapon, no struggle, no intruder. Yet he was murdered. Mrs. Fenwick stiffened. Hale snorted. Miss Vale's hands clenched. Kramer shifted his weight. You're sticking to that, huh? Yes, Wolfe said. Because the alternative is too absurd to tolerate. I leaned against the desk, watching faces. This was Wolfe in his element, an orchestra conductor about to bring down the baton. Mr. Fenwick, Wolfe continued, suffered from a known cardiac condition. Mrs. Fenwick's eyes flicked toward him. Wolfe noticed. He always does. He was advised, Wolfe said, that immediate medical attention was necessary in the event of collapse, dizziness, or loss of consciousness. That's not a secret, Crane said quickly. Indeed, Wolfe replied. Which makes what followed so interesting. He turned his gaze to Miss Vale. Miss Vale found Mr. Fenwick alive. Miss Vale gasped. Alive, Wolfe repeated firmly. Breathing. Unconscious. And unattended. Mrs. Fenwick shook her head. That's impossible. No, Wolfe said. It is merely inconvenient. Kramer frowned. You're basing this on her confession, Wolfe said, nodding to Miss Vale. Which is genuine in remorse but false in scope. Miss Vale looked up, tears in her eyes. I didn't want to be the one. Wolfe inclined his head. Precisely. Hale scoffed. This is insane. You're saying we all stood around waiting for him to die? Wolfe's eyes fixed on him. No, Mr. Hale. I am saying you all noticed, and refrained. I cut in casually. Everybody noticed the quiet, remember? The pacing stopped. Hale flushed. That doesn't mean. Silence, Wolfe said sharply. The word fell like a gavel. Each of you, Wolfe said, his voice even and relentless, performed a small act of restraint. Mrs. Fenwick noticed the absence of sound and did not investigate. Mr. Hale welcomed it. Miss Vale hesitated. Mr. Crane assumed others would act. Crane bristled. I wasn't even there. And yet, Wolfe said, you had spoken with Mr. Fenwick earlier. You knew his condition. You knew the risks. Crane's smile cracked. Just slightly. You all, Wolfe said, relied on one another's silence. Kramer exhaled. You're describing moral failure, not murder. Wolfe turned to him. Inspector, if 4 men agree not to warn a fifth of an oncoming train, have they killed him, or merely obeyed the schedule? The room went very still. Mrs. Fenwick spoke then, her voice controlled but tight. You're accusing us of conspiring without speaking. Yes, Wolfe said. A silent conspiracy. Hale laughed harshly. We never planned anything. No, Wolfe agreed. You planned nothing. That was sufficient. Miss Vale sobbed. I thought someone else would call. And so did everyone else, Wolfe said. That is the genius, and the cowardice, of your arrangement. Crane straightened. You can't prove intent. Wolfe smiled faintly. Intent is demonstrated by coordination. He leaned forward. Each of you knew Mr. Fenwick's habits. Each of you recognized the significance of the silence. Each of you chose not to be the first to break it. Kramer shook his head. That's thin. Then consider this, Wolfe said. When Mr. Goodwin began disrupting your agreement, altering narratives, testing reactions, someone attempted to kill him. All eyes swung to me. Hey, I said. I survived. Barely. Mrs. Fenwick gasped. Hale stared. Crane went pale. That, Wolfe said, was action. Crane found his voice. That proves nothing. It proves impatience, Wolfe said. Someone feared exposure. He turned his gaze slowly from face to face. The conspiracy held as long as silence was shared. Once it was threatened, someone acted. Hale's voice cracked. Which one? Wolfe smiled again, thin, deliberate. That, he said, we will address shortly. Kramer stepped forward. You're not giving me a name. Not yet, Wolfe said. Because the final contradiction has not spoken. The room seemed to lean inward. Mr. Fenwick, Wolfe continued, would have survived had any one of you acted promptly. Miss Vale whispered, I know. And that, Wolfe said, is why your confession is false. It removes the essential element. Which is? Kramer asked. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Agreement. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, for the moment. I have said enough, Wolfe concluded. Tomorrow, I will say more. Tomorrow. Crane snapped. Yes, Wolfe said calmly. At this hour. Mrs. Fenwick rose abruptly. This is outrageous. Madam, Wolfe said, so is dying in a locked study while 4 people listen to nothing. They filed out one by one, shaken, angry, frightened. The silence they carried with them was no longer protective. It was accusatory. When the door closed, I let out a breath I'd been holding since lunch. You enjoy this, I said. Wolfe reached for his beer. Moderately. You didn't name anyone. Patience, Archie. I looked toward the door. Someone's going to panic. Yes, Wolfe said. And when they do, they will speak. Outside, the city made noise like it always did, horns, voices, life. Inside the brownstone, the silence had turned against itself. Tomorrow, it would finally talk. Chapter 8, The Loudest Silence. Morning came to the brownstone like it always did, on schedule, unapologetic, and entirely uninterested in human guilt. Fritz clattered in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and butter rising like a promise that life would continue regardless of who ruined it the night before. Upstairs, the orchids received their careful inspection, serene and indifferent witnesses to human failure. Nero Wolfe sat in his red leather armchair, vast and immovable, as if he had never shifted an ounce since the night before. A glass of beer rested at his elbow. Civilization, by his standards, was ready. I wasn't. You slept? I asked. Briefly, Wolfe said. Adequately. I had dreams, I said. None of them were charitable. Wolfe glanced at the clock. Our guests will arrive shortly. Kindly ensure they do. They did. Inspector Kramer came first, resigned and curious in equal measure. Then Mrs. Fenwick, pale and brittle. Gideon Crane followed, jaw set, confidence polished but thin. Martin Hale arrived restless, eyes darting. Miss Vale came last, quiet, already defeated. They took their places like actors who had missed rehearsal but knew the ending was bad. Wolfe let the silence stretch. He always did. Silence was his opening argument. Then he spoke. Last evening, Wolfe said calmly, I described a crime of cooperation. Today, I will complete it. Crane crossed his legs. You still haven't said who did anything. On the contrary, Wolfe replied. I have said exactly that. Kramer sighed. Wolfe. Inspector, Wolfe said, without turning, be patient. He addressed the room. Harold Fenwick collapsed in his study. He was alive for several minutes, perhaps longer. He required assistance. None arrived. Mrs. Fenwick whispered, we didn't know. Yes, Wolfe said. You did. Her head snapped up. I did not see him. You did not hear him, Wolfe corrected. Which you noticed. He turned to her fully now. Madam, you told Mr. Goodwin you noticed the absence of your husband's pacing. You expected it. When it did not occur, you chose reassurance over inquiry. Her voice trembled. I thought he wanted privacy. Privacy, Wolfe said gently, is not customary during cardiac distress. She sagged back into the sofa. Wolfe turned his gaze to Martin Hale. You, Wolfe said, welcomed the silence. You said you were glad he had, finally shut up. Hale clenched his fists. That doesn't mean I wanted him dead. No, Wolfe said. It means you did not want him saved. Hale stared at the floor. Wolfe shifted his attention to Miss Vale. You found him alive, Wolfe said. You hesitated. You expected someone else to act. Miss Vale nodded, tears spilling freely now. I thought, surely someone would. Yes, Wolfe said. You all did. Finally, Wolfe turned to Gideon Crane. And you, Mr. Crane, Wolfe said, are the hinge upon which this silence turned. Crane stiffened. I wasn't there. No, Wolfe agreed. You were elsewhere, conveniently. But you had spoken to Mr. Fenwick that evening. So, Wolfe said, you knew his condition had worsened. Crane opened his mouth, then closed it. You also knew, Wolfe continued, that a change to Fenwick Consolidated's controlling interest would be triggered upon his death. Kramer snapped to attention. What change? Wolfe smiled faintly. An alteration that benefited Mr. Crane, but only marginally. Not enough to justify murder. Crane's voice rose. This is absurd. Indeed, Wolfe said. Which is why you did not commit murder. The room froze. You merely, Wolfe said, ensured that no one interrupted its natural progression. Crane shook his head. You can't prove I did anything. No, Wolfe said. But I can prove you did nothing, deliberately. Crane laughed harshly. That's nothing but philosophy. No, Wolfe replied. It is law. He turned to Kramer. Inspector, Mr. Crane made a phone call shortly after 9:30, Wolfe said. Not to Mr. Fenwick, but to Mrs. Fenwick. Mrs. Fenwick gasped. You said. I said nothing, Wolfe interrupted. You assumed. Kramer stared at Crane. You called her. Crane's face went gray. I was checking in. On what? Kramer demanded. Crane faltered. Wolfe supplied it. On whether the silence was holding. Crane's shoulders slumped. That was it, the moment the conspiracy finally made noise. You didn't have to tell anyone what to do, Wolfe said. You merely confirmed that no one was doing anything. Crane whispered, I thought it would pass. Yes, Wolfe said. And it did. Permanently. Kramer straightened. You're telling me Crane coordinated this, without instructions, without orders, just by maintaining silence? Precisely, Wolfe said. He was the axis. The others were aligned already. Kramer exhaled slowly, then nodded. That's enough. He stepped toward Crane. Gideon Crane, you're under arrest, for criminally negligent homicide and conspiracy. Crane did not resist. He looked almost relieved. Mrs. Fenwick sobbed quietly. Hale stared into nothing. Miss Vale wept openly. As Kramer led Crane out, the room felt suddenly emptier, and louder. When the door closed, Wolfe leaned back in his chair, the matter finished. That, he said, is the danger of shared silence. It absolves everyone until it condemns them all. I poured myself a drink and leaned against the desk. You know, I said, people like to think murder requires violence. Wolfe lifted his beer. People like to think many comforting things. Outside, New York roared, horns, voices, footsteps, the living insisting on being heard. Inside the brownstone, the orchid stood immaculate, the armchair reclaimed its authority, and Nero Wolfe returned to his routine as if nothing had happened. As for Harold Fenwick, he had died in perfect quiet. And the silence that killed him had finally spoken.